Every crew has a press conference 30 days prior to launch, and this was our formal press conference to wear ties and get all dressed up. One of the nice things about being at NASA is wearing flight suits and T-shirts every day. On the right, you'll see me. Next to me, Charlie Walker, a McDonnell Douglas engineer on his second space flight. David Griggs, the Navy captain, pilot, on his first flight. Dr. Jeffrey Hoffman, an astronomer, on his first flight. Dr. Ray Seddon, a medical doctor. Don Williams, our pilot. And Colonel Bo Bobko, our commander, on his second space flight. She has a little trouble on Earth standing up. This is a photograph of our crew patch. Every crew designs their own patch, and obviously we think ours is better than anybody else's. This is the night before the launch, what is known as night viewing. Early in the morning on launch day, we're coming out of the crew quarters to get on the crew bus. This was really a very unbelievable experience for me, to think that I was really part of a NASA crew. Even after the months of training, it was hard to believe that I was going out. This is the white room, and getting into my flight gear prior to going into the orbiter to be strapped in. You'll see just prior to launch these hydrogen igniters to pick up any stray hydrogen to prevent explosive mixtures. You see the main engines light at about 6.8 seconds prior to launch. They will spool up, become white hot and stable, and then at 0 the solid rocket boosters will ignite. And once they ignite, you know you're going to be going someplace for 2 minutes, and you hope it's in the right direction. This is the initial launch sequence, and it's in slow motion. We're moving much more rapidly than that, but you can see the tremendous smoke and fire. See the large white solid rocket boosters in the orange external tank containing liquid hydrogen and oxygen. We'll start a roll reversal to our right to go over on our back. By the time we get to 19,000 feet, we'll be at Mach 1. And amazingly enough, by the time those solid rocket boosters complete their burn in 2 minutes, we're about 25 miles downrange, about 160,000 feet above the Earth, and traveling at 5.5 times the speed of sound. Here you can see the tremendous amount of flame and smoke and fire that come out of the solid rocket boosters, trailing several hundred feet behind the orbiter as we're accelerating ever more rapidly. Here's a view showing the solid rocket boosters being kicked off by explosive devices. They will then float back to the Atlantic Ocean via parachute, be picked up, brought back to Brigham City at Thiokol, and refilled with solid propellant to be reused again. You see us continuing on into space on the 3 main engines and burning the liquid hydrogen and oxygen until we are inserted into orbit. Then that tank will be also kicked off the orbiter, will disintegrate over the Indian Ocean after having made about 2/3 of an orbit around the Earth. And this is a very typical Earth view. Always there is a lot of cloud cover. We are a wet planet with more than 2/3 of the Earth's surface covered with water. Therefore, that produces a lot of cloud cover. You see a body of water coming up on the left-hand center side of the picture. You may be able to recognize it. In fact, I'll give you a second or two to see if you do before I identify it. If you haven't already figured it out, it's the Great Salt Lake. Looks very different from several hundred miles above the Earth. But I'm sure now as we're overhead, you'll be able to recognize it. And just in the center of the picture at this time, you see a small body of water, and that is the Bear Lake. You see how rapidly we're traveling. Mach 25, or 25 times the speed of sound, is around 17,500 miles an hour. And to put that into perspective for you, when I travel back and forth to Washington, D.C., it usually takes a little over 3.5 hours eastbound, a little over 4 hours westbound. if we could do it in the orbiter, it would take about 5 minutes. As a matter of fact, on our first orbit, Bo invited me up to the flight deck and said, "Come up and see South America." And I said, "Well, Bo, I'll be up in 3 or 4 minutes. I've got to hook up some electrical gear and get my experiments running." And by the time I got up there, I looked out, and all I could see was water. And I said, "What happened to South America?" And he said, "Well, you missed it, Jake." Well, just in a period of 5 minutes, you could miss an entire continent. These pictures don't do justice to looking back at the Earth because the limitations of a camera lens, even when it's wide angle, it really doesn't show you the panorama and the scope of the Earth. Here you see the orbiter flying tail down, and again the Great Salt Lake. You can see Promontory Point. You can see the railroad causeway going across the lake and creating the darker color in the north part and the lighter turquoise in the south part of the lake. It's impossible for me to describe the beauty of the Earth from space. I don't have the vocabulary, and certainly these pictures don't do it justice. Here you see us deploying our first satellite. Our right wing is down because once you're in space, there is no up, there is no down, there is no sideways, there's no aerodynamics, so it makes no difference what direction or attitude the spacecraft is in. Satellite is ejected and is spinning to stabilize it. On the bottom of it, you see a gray engine that is a third-stage Minuteman motor. And approximately 45 minutes after deployment of the satellite, that engine will ignite and will push the satellite into geosynchronous orbit. That simply means that it stays in a stationary position over the Earth and rotates with the Earth and therefore provides communications or TV pictures. This is our SYNCOM satellite, and we called it our Frisbee deployment. You may have noticed a white antenna on the top of it. At this point, that white antenna should have been coming up, and we were concerned that it was not. And unfortunately, the satellite did not work properly. It is spinning at a much slower rate than it should, floating above the ocean below us. And it's about 15 feet in diameter, weighs about 15,000 pounds on Earth. But essentially, at this point, it's an $85 million piece of junk that isn't working. An Ohm's engine burn, I'll show you what it does to Dr. Seddon, the orange juice following her in zero gravity across the middeck. What we're doing is igniting those engines to maneuver away from the satellite to give us time to work with Houston and try and figure out what was wrong with the satellite and to see if we would be able to fix it. And we'll get back to that later in the film. Here you see me on the middeck of the orbiter Discovery, placing electrodes on my head. You can see that I was a perfect subject for this particular experiment. If I had had hair, it would have been very difficult for me to perform these electroencephalograms. You'll also see the results of zero or microgravity. Everything floats. Even those alcohol swabs that I was trying to put back in the drawer float away. And that drawer, equipment drawer, weighed 80 or 85 pounds on Earth, but I've got to make sure that it's pushed at least halfway back in so that it won't float away. I've got to make certain that I have a toe hooked under a foot restraint so that I don't float away. You'll notice there are blue rectangles or patches on the starboard or right bulkhead of the middeck. Those are Velcro strips. I don't know how we could have ever flown in space without Velcro. As I said, everything will float, it will move around. It's a little hard to get used to the concept that my 175 pounds weighs nothing, just like the checklist, the alcohol swabs. So you need to be able to hold things down, and that's why Velcro is so useful. Now, I practiced these experiments for weeks prior to going into space so that I could get baseline data to compare with the onboard data. And then after I got back from the flight, we also did additional tests so that you had before, during, and after results of these various types of medical tests. Now I'm hooking up the electrodes, and you'll see floating in front of me an amplifier, a silver amplifier. It was always a problem in doing the experiments on Earth. It isn't very heavy. It weighs about a pound. But nevertheless, I would tape it to my shoulder, try and keep it in place. It was constantly falling off. Then it would jerk the electrodes, pull the adhesive tape, and the adhesive tape patches off my head, and that's very tender skin up there, believe me, to have that jerked off. But as you can see in zero gravity, that amplifier is no problem at all. It simply floats in front of me, places no pressure on the wires, does not pull the electrodes off. Also, the recorder is hooked to my flight pants with just a 1-inch square of Velcro. Dr. Seddon operated the American echocardiograph, which is like a sonogram that they use in prenatal cases to take pictures of infants still in the womb. This is one that is specially designed for taking pictures of hearts. Dr. Seddon did this on herself and on Jeffrey Hoffman and I 3 or 4 times each day. The pictures on the video were amazingly clear and crisp, showing all 4 chambers of our heart and the mitral valve. Taking pictures of the video are not too good, but you can see that floppy valve in the middle of Ray's heart flopping back and forth. The actual pictures, we could see the blood flows, we could see all the valves operating. We did get some very good information on changes in heart and zero gravity. Charlie Walker is on his 2nd space flight, a McDonnell Douglas engineer. Behind him is an electrophoresis machine. This processes pharmaceuticals, and Charlie is taking samples of that particular pharmaceutical, putting them into a sample board. As you can see, he needs to hook a toe under something to stabilize himself. He's having a little hard time floating around. Now, that was more or less deliberate to show you the effects of zero gravity. And you'll see after he takes his samples how easy it is in zero or microgravity for him to work on the bottom of his machine. You don't have to lean down. He just turns upside down. Jeff finds himself in the way of the camera, so he just pushes up and over and goes over the top and out of the way. I wish I could describe to you how much fun it is to operate like Superman, to be in zero gravity. Here we are on the flight deck, and Jeff is going to demonstrate some rather heavy gyro-stabilized binoculars that, although they weigh nothing and float, there's enough friction internally that they do oscillate considerably. I've got some more experiments on, in this case taking automatic blood pressure and pulse readings, and I'm keeping myself from floating up to the overhead of the spacecraft with my hand. Now, we were the first crew to take toys into space. This was our toy box. NASA was rather interesting. They decided at first that maybe we shouldn't take toys, and after we explained that it had already been set up, and the educational people were expecting us to do these experiments in space, NASA Public Affairs said, well, okay, we understand that you've got to go ahead with it, but don't smile. Don't look like you're having fun when you play with your toys. Well, we did have fun, and these experiments have been very valuable in schools across the country, because it shows young people exactly how the principles of physics work. They can much better relate to zero gravity when they see common toys that they are accustomed to, how they work in zero gravity. So we felt that they were very good experiments and very useful. First of all, you see Bo with a very inexpensive gyro. I believed all those textbooks about the laws of physics and laws of motion, but it's amazing when you can actually see that they work just like the textbooks tell you they do. The precession of the gyro is amazing. Here's Jeff upside down in the orbiter playing with a little wheelo that would work with gravity on Earth, but he has to impart some centrifugal force to it. He's hanging on to the treadmill, but totally inverted.